I'm back with a review of Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. In this video I'm going to talk about chapter 4, which is titled Germans and History. In this chapter, Sowell talks about the history of the German people. He talks about Germany before its formation, he talks about Germans all around the world, and the most important part of this chapter is when he seeks to answer the question of whether the rise of Hitler and the Nazis were a natural manifestation of actions and beliefs held by Germans prior to the Holocaust, or if they were an aberration. Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English, French, Spanish, and Italian. But the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rise of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, it has colored the way Germans have been seen since then, as well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale? As for relations with the indigenous population of the Western Hemisphere, Germans were noted for getting along with the Indians better than other Europeans did. As noted in an earlier essay, in the German colonies of East Africa, slave traders were hanged on the spot when they were caught in the act. The history of pre-Hitler Germans, whether home or abroad, can readily stand comparison with that of most Europeans, just as the record of Europeans can stand comparison with those of most other races around the world. That is what makes what happened under Hitler and the Nazis even more chilling. If this happened with Germans, it could happen with any other people. There were anti-Semites in Germany, as in other countries, and their words can now be read as alarming warnings in light of our knowledge of what lay ahead. But there was little at the time to serve as a credible warning of such a monstrous and almost inconceivable event as the Holocaust. Incredibly, throughout his whole analysis, Mr. Sowell fails to mention, even in passing, the only other genocide committed by Germans prior to the Holocaust which had racial motivations and justifications, which is the Herero and Nama genocide in Namibia. This happened over 30 years before the ascension of the Nazis. Considering how clearly well-read Mr. Sowell is, it is inconceivable that this was out of ignorance. That grave omission was clearly intentional, because it went against his preconceived conclusion. Between 1904 and 1908, Germans committed a genocide against the Herero people and Nama people of modern-day Namibia. They exterminated over 80,000 Herero people, which was like 80% of their population, and they exterminated 50% of the Nama people. The Herero people were initially welcoming of the German settlers. They signed treaties. But of course, these German settlers, which had come from Europe to Africa with the mindset of racial superiority, could not fathom relating with the Africans as equals. So after some time, they stopped respecting the treaties. The Germans started beating the Herero people, unaliving them, sexually assaulting their women with impunity. It was so bad that it was even known back in Germany.
The reputation of German colonial soldiers when it came to the abuse of African women was so bad that it even became known back in Germany, as seen in this newspaper cartoon strip.
The settlers wanted more land, and in 1903 they already started discussing a war against the native people to take that land. These tensions reached a boiling point. In January 1904, the Herero could no longer take the abuses from the Germans anymore, and they staged a revolt. Loved ones of those unalived, sexually assaulted, abused by the Germans exploded in anger. This revolt was led by their leader, Samuel Maharero. He instructed his people to not target missionaries and the women and children, only combatants. Of course, some of his people did not heed to this instruction, but on a whole, it was mostly the German soldiers that were targeted. Over 100 German soldiers and settlers were unalived in this revolt, and this revolt was used as a pretext by the Germans to do what, of course, they always wanted to do and they had previously planned to do, even before this revolt a year earlier. The Germans actually struggled to put down this rebellion. It had extreme success on the onset. The Germans then decided to send a certain general to Namibia to put down this rebellion. A man that came with a reputation of being a no-nonsense general. He went on to give an extermination order against the Herero. This was the order. I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. Any Herero found inside the German frontier, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. Such are my words to the Herero people. Not all the Herero people were involved in this revolt. Some stayed away from it. Some pledged their support and allegiance to the Germans out of fear, naturally, because they were more equipped. But that didn't stop the Germans from unaliving them, of course. In a particularly grim incident, on the 23rd of January 1904, the Herero people of Ochimbingwe, people that were not involved in the revolt, gathered to have Sunday service. They were oblivious to the fact that the Germans were effectively carrying out a race war. So they gathered to have their normal Sunday service. German soldiers showed up close to the church. They surrounded the entire church with barbed wire. They then took position and opened fire right in the middle of their Sunday service. This should give you an idea of their complete disregard for Christianity and should put to rest the nonsensical idea that colonization was to spread the gospel. The only religion they subscribed to was the religion of white supremacy. They had no respect for the church, they had no respect for the word of God, and they certainly did not take the commandments, thou shalt not kill, to heart. The Germans hunted the Herero for months, unaliving thousands. After many months of relentless violence against the Herero people, the Germans then claimed they were ready for a ceasefire. They were ready to forgive the Herero. The Herero were naturally terrified of these people and they did not believe them. But the Germans were able to convince them that they meant what they said. It turned out that they lied once again, and once the Herero finally surrendered, the Germans then went on to put them in concentration camps in horrific conditions where they were tortured and many died. Unaliving them was not enough. The Germans then carried thousands of their skulls and remains back to Germany to be experimented on to prove their supposed racial inferiority. The likes of Eugen Fischer were fully involved in this, and he went on to work with the Nazis. In fact, Hitler even read a lot of Eugen Fischer's books and even referenced him in his book, My Struggle. After exterminating the Herero people, the coast was now clear for the German settlers and soldiers to take over the land. That land was never given back to the natives even after decolonization. Till this very day, most of the land is still held by descendants of those murderous German settlers and soldiers, while the descendants of those Herero and Nama people have nothing.
The land my family owned belongs now to a German farmer. It's no longer ours. Our people subsequently were pushed into the barren areas of the Kalahari, in the semi-desert area. That's why they farmed, and that's where I grew up. That part is painful. Until it is redressed, it will continue to be painful.
When the Herero people finally decide to take back their land, be sure to hear the likes of apartheid baby Elon talk about white genocide. The links between the Herero genocide and the Nazis later are undeniable. Apart from Eugen Fischer, many soldiers who took part in crushing the Herero went back to Germany and joined the Nazi Party, most notably General Franz Ritter von Epp. As a young man, he took part in the Herero genocide. When he got back to Germany many years later, he joined the Nazi Party, where he went on to be elected in parliament. The Germans took a lot of pictures of their atrocities in Namibia. There's a lot of evidence of their crimes. But of course, at that time, they didn't have to worry about war crimes trials. Extermination of the lesser races was something fully accepted back in Europe at that time. This is far bigger than the Germans. They did not invent racial science. The belief of racial hierarchies, the belief that some races are inferior while some are superior, was simply taken to the next level by the Nazis. It has a long history. It has roots in European Western civilization. These were ideas that were supported and propagated by the very best minds in Europe. The celebrated scientists, the most influential philosophers, the greatest minds of European societies all agreed with variations of these ideas. Let's hear from them. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. Charles Darwin, From the Descent of Man, 1871. The Negro is an example of animal man in all his savagery and lawlessness. If we wish to understand him at all, we must put aside all our European attitudes. G.W.F. Hegel. The Negroes of Africa have by nature no feelings that rises above the trifling. Immanuel Kant. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or to the black peoples of Australia by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has come in and taken its place. I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes. It will spread a lively terror. Winston Churchill. I'm sure you can see the similarities in worldview between Mr. Churchill and the certain infamous German with a funny mustache that is seen as the most evil man that ever lived. In one of his most famous speeches in World War II, Churchill said this about the Nazis: "A monstrous tyranny never surpassed in a dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime." So basically he was expressing the sentiments that the Nazis were an evil the world had never seen. That is of course not accurate. The Germans are by no means the only ones guilty of extermination of quote-unquote inferior races. Their European brothers have committed similar atrocities all around the world. The British exterminated the Tasmanian people of Australia. Because of them, today, no single full-blooded Tasmanian exists. The Spanish effectively exterminated the indigenous people of Haiti, that is the Taino people. Europeans in America exterminated the Native Americans. The Belgians unalived millions of people in the Congo. This doesn't even scratch the surface. One little known fact: over 100 years before the Nazis, the French invented gas chambers. In the midst of the Haitian Revolution in 1803, in Napoleon's bid to put down the revolution and reinstate slavery, he approved the use of all means. This led to the invention of a very primitive form of gas chambers, although nowhere near as sophisticated as that used by the Nazis over a century later. What they did was that they burnt sulfur, and when you burn sulfur it becomes poisonous. They trapped the Africans in ship holds. Then they released the burnt sulfur for them to be suffocated and poisoned to death. So when the Nazis deployed gas chambers, it was basically an innovation, an improvement on an earlier French European practice. The Nazis' ascension to power and quest to dominate Europe was in a way a kind of poetic justice. The French, who had invented gas chambers, were then invaded by the Nazis, and it took, ironically, African soldiers from their colonies to help liberate France from the Nazis. The Belgians, after unaliving and enslaving millions in Congo, were then invaded themselves and occupied. The Nazis then went on to unalive thousands of Belgians and enslave 500,000. The Nazis enslaved them and forced them to work for their own benefit. Very similar to what King Leopold, their king, did out in Congo. When their people in Congo were committing their atrocities in the name of white supremacy, they probably never envisioned a world where that same ideology would be twisted in a way that even excluded other white people like them and justified violence against them. A clear case of the chickens coming home to roost. The great Aimé Césaire expressed these sentiments quite poetically and brilliantly in his book Discourse on Colonialism. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, "How strange!" But never mind, it's Nazism. It will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism, that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they had tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absorbed it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to the non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. What am I driving at? At this idea that no one colonizes innocently, that no one colonizes with impunity either, that a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies colonization and therefore force, is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which irresistibly, progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler, its punishment. Did Europe learn its lesson? In the same decade, Aimé Césaire wrote this book, the 1950s. The British went on to deploy concentration camps in Kenya under the leadership of a certain Winston Churchill. When Senegalese African soldiers who fought to liberate France demanded rightful pay owed to them, the French responded by committing a massacre against them. They unalived 300 African soldiers who had literally just liberated France from the Nazis. The massacre is known as the Herero massacre. When the parade for celebration came, de Gaulle did not like the sights of a predominantly black army liberating France. He replaced the black soldiers who actually went to war with white soldiers, some of who had never even seen combat before. So what he did was that he whitened it. Europe did not learn its lesson.